Hello, everyone. I welcome the panelists on stage. I don't want to be here alone. Just a second. Okay. Okay, getting organized here. Digital music infrastructures is the topic of this conversation that I look forward to have with a great group of people here on the panel. I would like to, over the next hour, look with you into the digital environments, the platforms, and the facilities that we use as participants in music culture. And in the description to this, we wrote that by infrastructure, we understand a very broad set of arrangements. And I look forward to hearing what you understand exactly by infrastructures, or how you view this. So for me, it could be the design of an interface to the overall business model of a platform that then shapes how the services are delivered that we are using, for example. And I think one thing that is important to note maybe is that we're probably looking through an independent cultural lens, because we are all artists or cultural producers who are maybe working more with kind of underground culture, as you say. Over the next hour, let's talk about how do digital music infrastructures shape our practice? What do we think about the status quo? Are the structures supportive to our maybe different visions of music culture? And then also, I'm interested to hear about all your different initiatives that you are involved with, that we also spend some time talking about. And I briefly introduce all of you, so you don't have to say your bios every time. So we have in the middle Daniela Seitz, who is cultural manager and curator and co-founder of the Cream Cake event platform and label. And I think you work with lots of artists who operate outside of traditional music industry structures, also lots of young people, and I've discovered lots of great artists through your work, so that's great. Then just right next to me, or left, is Peter Kern, musician and creative technologist, co-producer of the MeeBlip open source synthesizer, publisher of Create Digital Music, a new site with a focus on music technologies. So, huh? An old site. A news site, an old news site. So you think and write about digital technologies in connection to music almost every day. So, and then on the very left, Matt Dryhurst is an artist, and you release music research and artworks. You collaborate with Holly Herndon a lot with the Pan label. You're a lecturer at NYU, and you developed Saga, a project that I'm going to ask you more about later. And you are an advisor to the streaming service Resonate that we've heard. So those of you who have been here earlier, that we've heard a little bit about that already today. Welcome. As an introduction, I would like to hear from you. All of you, when I invited you to the panel, all of you responded quite interested and enthusiastically about the topic, saying, "Oh yeah, this is really a good, an important topic." And I would like to know why. Why did you say that? Do we have all microphones? No, we have two.
We have two. I can start.
You want to start? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because when you ask me what I think about music and digital infrastructures, we just founded a festival in Tokyo, which is called Infra, and so it is playing with this obvious idea of how you provide infrastructure for people who don't actually use the actual infrastructure, who is traditionally based. And so for us it is always this question of how we do things in general, and how you do things, you're gonna establish your own infrastructure. So how do you operate your business? How do you curate a program? Or how do you support your artists, and who is benefiting from this? So with Creamcake or 3HD is another project we do, and Infra Now, it's like a total different scene which hasn't been on the main spotlight for years, and we create this platform for them and support them and establish for them a sort of structure and possibility to perform. And
okay, and then
hey, yeah, so on that topic, on the topic of infrastructure, I mean, I deal with it a lot in my work. I think what Daniela's built is kind of like a perfect case study in a way for a new form of independence. And so when I think about infrastructure in music, the only infrastructure I've ever really cared about has been the independent musical infrastructure. And one of the things that I think is quite disappointing or urgent at this point is the need to kind of redefine what we understand to be independence in an era of platform capitalism, in this era where you can listen to a punk record on the same page as a Rihanna record, and most people are experiencing these things in those ways. And of course there are independent initiatives happening, but generally they tend to be, you know, not necessarily in the same form that one would understand independent music to be classically, and so I think Creamcake's like a really good example of that. Yeah, so that's really the big question for me, is like, what does being independent today mean beyond the kitsch of independence that we're often sold and that has been subsumed into you know, just general commercial discourse, right?
My mind is already off track because that's already a lot of interesting ideas. I mean, I guess I'm kind of well. I mean, to follow up on what Matt's suggesting, I think there's probably not a clear dividing point between independent and whatever a non-independent artist is. I'm happy to be a non-independent artist if someone wants to give me a big EDM deal of some sort. I mean, I think, yeah, I think even as you talk to artists who you would have traditionally thought of as kind of commercially successful or on major labels, are things that a lot of the things that they say are quite similar to things that you hear from very independent, very underground artists. Everybody's kind of contending with the same vehicles for communication. And I mean, I'm kind of interested by the thing that a lot of other people see as a problem, right? So people come from this kind of traditional industry model, I think because it is based on this very particular form of scarcity and maybe a very particular form of control and control of distribution, tend to see this growth in production, or the growth in the number of people making music and the ease of kind of using technology to play music, they see as somehow a problem. Me being biased and having always kind of made most of my living off that sort of production side of things and not just listening and distribution, I always kind of saw it as something positive. But it seems like the structures that we have for communication somehow don't match up with that reality. So the reality of people producing more diverse and kind of more music doesn't match up with internet distribution and communication methods that are themselves becoming more scarce. Everything from media to mechanisms for kind of discovery. That made sense.
Okay. Okay. So that's for the start, and I'd like to go deeper into your different perspectives over the course of the conversation. I think before we go deeper into discussing the actual issues, I'd be interested in also to get everybody on the same page to quickly look at what do we understand by infrastructures? What are we actually talking about? And I think you each from your perspectives, imagine you're on a lookout point overlooking a city or something. So this being the infrastructures you work with, like what are the building blocks that you see there, and what are the things that you find that you like, and what are the things that you don't like when you look out of the window? Do you want to start, Daniela, maybe from your perspective, maybe also of working with the kind of producers you work with? And
I mean, I think infrastructure is definitely, you can think about how can you bring something from A to B. It is like the really like the traffic thing. So how would you start having like a very talented emerging artist who is putting their sounds online on SoundCloud? How would you give him a chance to spread his music and find an audience and get paid and have a good experience? And actually approach different types of experiences through the career. And so I think in terms of that, when we do events or when we curate our music program, we just invite people who are just uploaded songs. It doesn't matter if they are like huge, if they have a following fan base or whatever. We just invite them, and they're really happy that they would never think about that they can come to Berlin and play a show. And so that's like the first step of creating like this, like very simple. It's just one email, you know. It takes me 5 minutes. I'm hearing this track, I'm hearing another one. It's like, wow, go to the Instagram. There's like a lot of like the aesthetics to this scene also. And then like, wow, just invite this person. And then over the time, when you do promotion and when you are like building your events, and then we talk to the artists and we give them like more knowledge about like how does this work, and that all comes to like the learning of from step 1 to step B. And then when we do the label, it's the same. Like an artist, he put out some stuff on SoundCloud. I'm just asking him if he wants to put out something with us, and then it's always like very transparent and very fair communication, because I haven't done it too, you know. So I'm looking for some music contracts from my friends. I'm going through them, like classic ones, or still from independent music scene. But then I'm like, this is too much. This is too much. So I'm making it down to the really essential points for like a contract with a label you can provide, and then I'm having a Skype meeting with the artist, and then we go through each point, and then it starts being like open and fair from scratch, you know. And that's part of it, you know. And I hear from a lot of friends that they just got the contract per email, and then they didn't want to sign it, or they didn't know what this paragraph means, or why is it like 10 pages long, and then they didn't sign it, but the record still came out, and so this contract is still bonding for some reason, you know. So it didn't really help the cause of not signing it. And so we just don't work like that in this very traditional way of like how this classic industries. But what I really like is adapting it to like very DIY thing, you know, and learning it. And then I'm saying like, I can do this by my own. It doesn't really matter of having this huge old school structure, and just adapt it in a very professional way. And
so from this, I hear like what you mentioned. You use just the kind of building blocks. So you have SoundCloud, where you find it was like the first point of emerging for someone, and then you have like the label, your own label, with a contract, with terms of collaboration. And you mentioned festivals also, no? You mentioned like where you want to place the artist, something like
I mean,
where the artist would be playing later, just as a way to look at what infrastructure like comprises. How's that?
Sounds good.
Do you want to build on like that picture?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of infrastructure, it's quite easy, right? It's like, how do you get this thing to people, right? And there's two lanes of that. In the one sense, it's like, how do you get it to people's ears remotely? And then there's how do you get it to people in space, which is something that's becoming increasingly difficult in expensive cities. So they're two parallel things. The latter one happens to represent, at this point in time, the closest thing to an income that most musicians have. And principally for me around these issues of infrastructure, it's saying, well, how much kind of agency does one feel within those structures, right? So bring up SoundCloud, for example. SoundCloud provides a service. It does a few things really, really well. It allows you to do only a few things with that, right? And so these infrastructures where you go from a scenario of like the old distribution industry, which in many cases was very limited. You're talking about passing physical things around. It's an infrastructural issue to me to say, well, why is it now that our level of engagement with this media when we receive it is actually somehow less than it once was? You have fewer options to tailor or customize someone's experience of this music there. That's an infrastructural problem, right? That's a design decision that has been made by an increasingly smaller and smaller pool of designers with these monopoly platforms, right? Similar, what used to be somewhat, I mean, very much connected, but somewhat disparate live and recorded or distribution music infrastructure, you're starting to see these two things blend into each other even more so now, right? Where there are fewer places for people to play, right? Cities are getting more expensive, so these kind of areas of congregation that one used to go into a place like a London or a New York or whatever, to make a name for yourself and to develop a culture on the ground there, that's becoming increasingly difficult for people who don't have independent money. And so in order to participate within the live music infrastructure, you know, if you have a band, where are you going to rehearse? So who gets to rehearse enough to be in a position to be supported by the festival networks, which are now increasingly influenced more and more by the design decisions of the distribution platforms, right? So if you end up being on a Spotify playlist, which I might add requires a certain kind of music, certain kinds of music thrive in playlist cultures where other kinds of music certainly don't thrive, you have a better chance to participate in the live music infrastructure, right? So these kind of questions for me are really pivotal, because now I tour the world playing music. I'm very fortunate with my partner Holly, and we go to these festivals, and it's very interesting to see over time and be like, yeah, like DJs, low overheads, no one can rehearse. It's the joke for me is, you know, DJ culture is kind of like the ultimate complement to the Silicon Valley ideology that you make profit by curating the work of others, you know. And I know, and DJ culture obviously has a wonderful venerated history, but it's kind of interesting to be like, oh, this works really well because it seamlessly flows into playlists, it seamlessly flows, and you see even as a performing artist on stage, the seamless transition from one artist to the next, like you move your record bag and another person brings their record bag there. This kind of seamless user experience of the festival environment works in terms of generating money and works for a certain agenda. But the question is, in the case of Cream Cake, I'll just use it as an example because you're here, what if you wanted to do something else? What are the affordances of that infrastructure at that point in time? And over time, what I fear I see down the line is what comes to represent a monoculture that has all of the trappings of the abandon of yesteryear. So we get to pretend that we're raving and all this wonderful history. And it's like, well, this stuff happened because people had space. And this stuff happened because people had control over their own infrastructures, which increasingly, even within our communities, is a conversation that people put down. They say you're old-fashioned, you know. So, well, it's like, no, actually, I think we should reserve the right to be critical of SoundCloud as much as we can celebrate their accomplishments. But like these infrastructural issues are of pivotal importance and end up having aesthetic ramifications, hard aesthetic ramifications for kids who, and I teach students who've grown up with this and know nothing else. You know, the idea, so anyway, I'll shut up talking about it now, but infrastructure for me, it's an aesthetic issue, actually, when you get down to it.
I can't problematize that any better than Matt just did, so I'll just broaden it and say, not that we have to go into all this stuff this evening, but I think that sort of, if you think about your musical experience, especially kind of coming from a traditional musical background, this extends from sort of early music education, and I've even taught keyboard skills and things, to this sort of instrumental musical experiences and experiences of playing music with other people. We used to have a culture where everybody was involved in, or not most everybody was involved in some kind of communal music practice. So trying to then turn music into something that's in the hands of a few people is something radically different. And that's why for some of us it's actually very deeply disturbing how often people from kind of this mainstream industry model repeat this idea of music making's too easy, too many people are making music. You know, so they're trying to protect some kind of very specific elite that they, not to be overly accusatory, but that grew out of a very strange reality at the kind of birth of recorded media. We seem to be returning back to something where everybody is making music. But then the question is the value of that music going to be measured based on this sort of strange remnants of this old system grafted onto some kind of new internet culture? I don't know. So there's a lot of deep, kind of disturbing questions in some level. But I would say, at the same time, we can also consider some of those other infrastructure elements. If you look at the musical output of a country that has public music education, even on the digital side of things, it's very different than that from a country that doesn't. So part of what seems to be tempering kind of access to the global music market is not just unequal access to the sort of recording distribution side of things, but also unequal access to music education or instrumental education, and differences there. So I think as we kind of hopefully widen to a more global music community, it'll be interesting to see kind of how we contend with that and contend with different music educational backgrounds. I think that's enough. Yes? Is it all of us or just me? All of us, okay. Well, there's a record. That's, yeah. We're all exciting each other and probably it's like just like injecting caffeine into one another. So let's slow down. We can slow down, exactly.
Yeah, let's slow down.
It will sound great to listen to the recording at low speed, which will also sound later, which will also make each of us sound much more authoritative. But in the meantime, let's slow down.
Yeah. It's also an infrastructural question.
Yes.
In a way. So that everybody can
usually remember
understand.
to do that. I did have a coffee just before. Go ahead. Let's try to slow down.
All right. So we've got, I drew a little picture of the infrastructural map, and I would like to, so we've looked into a little bit of a mixture of what's currently there with like Spotify playlist, big festival circuits, SoundCloud here, spaces to perform, the control that we have over the artworks. And from here, I'd like to draw a bit more into this before we get into the conversation. I hope we get it all together in the end. But I like to, because all of you are active in some way or the other to be an active in this space and to maybe change some of the things. And I think from those things we can learn also what is maybe, in addition to what you said, what's maybe a problematic or what needs to be changed. And so I would like to add this step, and then we can do the overall discussion. And Daniela, you've already started to talk a little bit about how you operate with Cream Cake, but maybe you could elaborate a bit further on what are you. So you are trying really to build your own independent network, and what you talked about the label and the type of contracts and so on. What are the points that you want to change or that you are doing differently than the others? Or some of the others.
So who doesn't know, Cream Cake is an event series. It is. It started as a club night or like a really like music night. We do shows at Ohm. We do another show at Berghain. But we also worked with How and KW to have more like an overlap of different interdisciplinary art forms. So, for instance, we work with like performance art, music, and then visual art. And then we build like installations around it and check out different environments and how music and art comes together. And so that's said for the beginning, right? So we are booking artists. We are try to pay them always as much as possible, which is also really interesting because no one actually really knows that when you offer someone a fee, I'm also restricted in some ways of how much I can pay this person because of entrance, and then there is like a lot of rent maybe, or there's like a different infrastructure behind that too, you know. So I think it is always problematic in terms of, in DIY culture, you start with emerging artists, and they are really newcomers in that way, and then they make a good record, they might become more powerful, and then we're not able to pay the fees anymore, for instance, because we don't have that money yet, except when we are applying for funding. So for instance with 3HD Festival it's much better because we got like funding from Citytex, and we always get fundings from Music Board, and that really helps also to support the artist in a much more sustainable way, because if you are doing a club night you won't make a living from our team, and also the artists when they play once a month, they will never make a living from this, you know. They have to play like each weekend and then 4 times, and then there is the club who can offer this kind of shows now. But if you are not really considering yourself as like someone who plays club music, then there's a total different infrastructure. Then you connect more maybe with new music venues, or you go into gallery context, and then there's no entrance, and then you don't get a fee, and then the sound system is shitty, and it's then a whole other story. So there needs to be like a fundamental funding for this type of scene, because it's so interdisciplinary that it is connecting on so many things. And I think that is like it's a challenge for us to open these doors also, and really hard work to really get more funding for the people behind the project, and also for the artists we would like to support. And that's like everyone needs to do this hard work until you might be not like so in the independent music scene anymore, because you're gonna be mainstream, or you're gonna be a mainstream festival. But to that point is really a long way. And I think that it's also good because you really learn. You just learn everything by yourself, you know, and you will make mistakes, and you will experience so many different things, which is really amazing. Because if you think about it before, you wouldn't have done anything. You would just have signed a contract, and then you give someone else the power to make the decisions, and searching for the wedding song or the live song, and really pushing the superstar or the pop star idea of like mainstream culture, and that's really something we never looked for.
Do you find the dependency on funding problematic in being independent? Like, is that
definitely, like the funding is always like, you write an application for like a festival, you really do like concept-based work. I mean, you sit there 2 weeks writing, and then it's all in the hands of the jury members. Like it's you don't really know them. They're also in a different age group sometimes, and they don't really know the context. So these people who make the decisions are not the ones who are going out or going to explore subculture in that sense, you know. They're coming more from academic background, very intellectual background, often very white male academic music background, and then it's like, if they don't try to get into the context, then we have also like a problem, you know. So this is like a challenging thing, that you are approach different new things, but you should never stop. I think that is like the what we always had. We always kept on going, and it's growing. And like, because Berlin is so wonderful in terms of like rent and the fees and everything, like the whole structure is still like such a wonderland bubble place, you know, which is allow us to do this in a certain extent, you know.
And
but otherwise it's not gonna, it's not there's no funding system in America in that sense, you know. Or but it's interesting because now for infra, for instance, we got money from Art Council Tokyo, and we got another fund, but it's not enough for going abroad and work with like a Japanese collaborator on like a 5 days festival, but we still want to do it because it is actually a wonderful idea. And now I'm applying for funding for the Norwegian government, for the Finnish Institute, and now you're collecting money from all these types of European cultural funds, which is amazing that this infrastructure exists. In America, for instance, it's not there, you know, or in other countries. And so you will start trying to find money. I mean, what's also interesting in terms of like infrastructure, because there's like a lot of money in cooperation in music. For instance, if you decide to work with a corporation, that is might helpful or can be like the point where money comes in, but then it's like then we grew up in Europe and in Germany, for instance, and I come from like museum background, and you never have sponsoring of a corporation in institutions, you know, that's not what we are having. But the tendency, for instance, if you look at the British system, there is fundraisers, there is a different financial structure towards like where private people give you budget. Or if you look at, like, I mean, there's like Red Bull, Ableton, Native Instruments, who are actually giving money, but then they also brand your event. So that's also like a question of the cooperative structure in general, if how you could approach them, or if you want to, you know, that's the decision making. Do you want to work on a cooperative level, and with who, and what's the purpose for the corporation?
So,
well, yeah, I mean, just I would say, I was sort of laughing about the United States, but I would say, you know, that still counts as, I think that still counts as an infrastructure, right? So this is just there's kind of a different infrastructure. I think the United States is really lacking in ideas like cultural diplomacy, just a little bit. Seems to be getting worse fast. But you know, I think there are things that maybe so coming from the States that I would take for granted that are not existing here, and that there's a culture of, I think there's a culture of public giving. Sometimes that can be less problematic even than some of the other things that we've talked about. There is a culture of kind of how to fundraise with private partners. While there isn't good federal arts infrastructure, sometimes there's quite good local arts infrastructure. So it's not, you know, it's a complicated situation in the U.S. And you know, I would also say there are certainly challenges to working with certain governments too, at least, and I think ethically as well. Obviously, that will impact your agenda in the same way that working with certain corporations would. That was it, kind of on this sort of funding infrastructure question. You had something there?
Sure. I'm spacing on the name, but there's a great book that University of Santa Cruz published talking about the legacy of German arts funding for the American avant-garde, like post the Second World War, and it's a remarkable book, and I need to, if you're curious about it, please get me afterwards, because I'll get my phone out and find it. But the argument within that is that most of what we understand to be the American avant-garde, your Cages and so on and so forth, wouldn't really exist if it weren't for the support of, and particularly things like jazz music, also that, you know, the Swiss and the French, and still to this day, do a huge job in supporting. So yeah, so taking, most of what we understand as music doesn't exist without taking that funding somehow. You know, there's a mythical period of time that suggests that it could exist by itself, but it most likely didn't in most cases, or at least for the people on the margins. So
we were supposed to slow down talking.
I actually tried to slow down.
are you okay?
It's okay.
Please say if it's we may be reminded if it's.
Expect that reach out.
Okay, so just to,
Well, I'll just add one thing, which is just to kind of back this up for a second. I guess because just personally, I'm terrible at solving most of the problems that we've just described, even for myself individually, when it comes to figuring out how financial infrastructure is meant to work, figuring out sometimes how to get paid. Sometimes is not my strongest skill, nor is business planning. But I would say, maybe to kind of look at the larger picture here, I think one fundamental question is, what really is the value of music? You know, and what will the value of music be to a society? And whether digital technology is involved because this sort of microprocessor light speed communication revolution is involved in everything right now. But that's not, I think that's not the point so much as figuring out where this value is. And I'm okay, I'm even okay with some of that value coming from something like advertising. I have no problem with this sort of global capital system getting involved with music as long as we can make it work for ourselves. I pay my bills based on advertising, so I don't see advertising on websites as being fundamentally evil, as some people do, because if I did, then I would also see paying my rent as somehow fundamentally evil, and I don't. But that's because I've been able to kind of take that system and make it work. It seems that just expecting the sort of world to organize itself around music making is wildly unrealistic, and the reason is that cultures tend to view musicians as dangerous a lot of the time. And the monetization of music is something that often gets marginalized almost nearly all of the time. So we really have to kind of figure out some way to go into the system that's geared against us, because people are mistrust what music does for society, because it seems to make people go crazy and consume a lot of drugs and alcohol and have sex. And that's not just a kind of like a Berlin club notion. This is something you can see repeated in lots of texts from centuries back from cultures all over the world. You can kind of do an ethnomusicological survey and find that there are many, many times that musicians start to be distrusted or marginalized from society. And that the kind of the main internet businesses right now are also really not organized around music and have not found a way to make much money off of music. So even as the industry complains that Google and Microsoft and Apple are getting rich off music, that's really not true. If nobody's making money off music on the internet, and then nobody has a real clear idea how to do that, the problem is they've started this cycle where they've kind of put music further and further and further to the side. So if our problems seem a bit intractable tonight, I think this is part of why. Because we have to remember that the natural tendency of what we do is for things to get marginalized. But that doesn't mean that the natural value of music is small. I think that the actual value of music to society is really great. And the problem is that we've had a disconnect with how the kind of businesses are built around it and the way that the music is valuable. And then on top of that, we have the industry coming in and saying there are too many musicians, which to me is a bit like saying that there are too many people good at math. What we actually need is more people to be making music and people's musical skill level to be higher. We shouldn't let the kind of this economic disconnect become an excuse for saying that everybody making music is a bad idea.
Maybe that's a good point to start talking about Resonate, I find. Just as an example, I hope you don't mind that we're not talking only about digital infrastructures so far, but the topic has broadened, but I think it's all related. It's good, yeah. I think it's okay. Because it all kind of connects together, space, money, and so on, into the question of how can we organize our independent music cultures. And so talking about financing, how do we, so you described how you try to make this culture you're interested in possible through finding ways to finance it. And so you're an advisor to a streaming service that is newly building up that does a few things differently. Do you want to describe?
Sure.
This, for a bit?
Peter Harris, who started the Resonate project, is in the room. And we have 20 minutes. So Resonate, I guess, to botch a small description, is a platform cooperative. The nature of a platform cooperative is, I guess if you were to boil it down, you say, think about a platform that you use, and then imagine if that was owned by the people that use it, is probably the easiest way to describe it. So there's a platform cooperative alternative to Uber, for example, where the prices are not determined from above by a few people who you don't get to communicate with. They're determined by the people who use it, by the drivers who use it. These are small projects right now, but they're increasing in number and scale. So Resonate, you could consider Resonate an equivalent to, right now, an equivalent to, say, a Spotify, in the sense that everybody who participates in Resonate, both the audience and the artists, own a share and a stake in Resonate. They collectively get to determine what features are added to the platform. And because it is built on the blockchain, which is something that many of you will probably, it's a word you'll probably hear a lot in this at this conference today, there's also lots of cool things that could be built on top of it. And so going back to that, the idea of agency I was discussing before, one could say that it starts out as a streaming service. There's so many other applications that can be determined by the community in order to speculate on new revenue streams or speculate on just cool new interactions around music that actually take music beyond a stagnant waveform that's compressed and shot around the world. All of these things become possible when we have collective ownership over that platform. Try convincing Spotify to make a change. You have to contend with their shareholders, because ultimately, and SoundCloud at that point, right? So, and to speak to Peter's point, I agree with you on a level where I say, when it comes to advertising, I would never judge someone for taking money. I'm actually, for my community, generally like a bit more diplomatic than most people about things like Red Bull or Ableton, for example. I think there's a place for that, because in many cases they are reinforcing or filling a gap that has been left by this kind of decimation of the music industry in the last 10, 15 years, and I think it's a very complicated issue. That being said, try imagining, an Apple commercial or any of the digital infrastructures, these monopolies that exist, with the kind of the goodwill or the momentum of youth culture and subculture removed from them. They'll start looking very dry and very kind of dusty. And the opportunity to me is to say, if we are the ones creating the value, and in my mind, the initiatives like yours, Daniela, are creating the value, because I've seen this multiple times. What you're putting on now will, through economic pressures, end up being grabbed by legacy labels, which then in turn will influence the major labels, which then in turn will influence what you hear on an advertisement in the middle of Karlsruhe. What you're doing is you're providing incredible value, because and traditionally independent musicians have provided that value. If we start to acknowledge that value and take ownership over it, and this is the funny thing, we have more tools available to us now. The costs of doing this are so much lower than they ever were, and the goodwill and the ability to find people to help you build these things, is increased tenfold from when the original independent pioneers built the original independent music industry. If we are to do that, who is to say that there isn't a financial incentive at the end of the day? But I do know that companies do profit from music. Maybe not directly. They take a loss on it, right? So, Apple paying however much for a Drake exclusive, they take a loss on that. But they benefit greatly from having that as part of their arsenal, and they understand that is a huge part of their ecosystem. It's a huge part of how they sell their products in the first place, right? So the speculation for me around projects like Resonate and other things like Saga, which we don't even need to go into, but other projects I've been involved with, and things that Holly and I do as part of our practice, is to say, well, what are the new kind of boundaries or frontiers for this kind of independence? If we were to foment a consciousness of a new form of independence, what kind of power do we have? And the answer might be nothing, but it's really worth asking that question, because at this point in time, it's cheaper to do it. We can get in touch with as many people as possible, and yet this conversation seems to be somewhat lacking, right? And the answer might be that through a blockchain system built, through a service like Resonate, musicians may not end up selling their songs, but they might end up selling moments. The live experience might expand and syndicate to 50 countries worldwide, and you need the song format itself might change. I mean, the economic structures around music have modulated the song format for as long as we know, right? Radio songs were shortened in order to work better with radio advertising, right? There's all different kind of ways the song can move that we might be able to monetize, but we don't have a fucking say in it when it comes to working with Apple, Spotify, or these platform monopolies. So it's not for me to answer the question, but all I'll say is we're not going to get any further unless we start taking more control over this, and I think Resonate is a great first start in doing that.
One thing or one service that I've been thinking about in context of this topic is Bandcamp, because I've always found like Bandcamp has kind of a not super cool image, but in a way, it's like I think the only like real platform that is working profitable or that actually has music as a business model, because there are, you know, you can stream there. After a few streams, you have to buy the song, which makes sense. So you can listen for free, then you buy it, you support an artist. I kind of really, I think it's quite a good site. Yeah. And I'm always wondering why people are not using it more. And so, huh?
People use it, and you also get the email address also by
just as something that already exists.
No, I really like it too. It's like it's a good platform, and it's also been around for a long time. And they also take a cut. I think it's like 15%.
15%.
And what's really funny is if you have a song online for 99 cents, and then Bandcamp gets a cut, and then PayPal gets a cut for the transition, and then you look at your Excel sheet, and then you have like millions of little tiny numbers, which adds up to 30 euros in the end. So this administrative process of like how this is monetized, also when you register your artists at GEMA, and then we do like the GEMA procedure, and then they collect all the tiny little coins together, and then in the end it's like 150 euro, and it's like really a lot of administrative work in this kind of old system. So it is kind of trying to monetize money with this kind of, okay, this is €1, but it's like how then this infrastructure works is quite weird, I think. For instance, we put out an EP last Friday. It is €4 for 4 tracks, so each track €1. We uploaded it through an aggregator, like digital distribution company, and it is on iTunes, but in iTunes it's just $2.99, because if the consumer buys it for a whole package, as like the whole 4 tracks, they give discount, and they don't even ask you, you know, they don't say, if you okay with this? And now this EP is in 270 shops, and it all has different price. And the only one who actually, I put everything correct. I wrote featured, always small. I wrote the artist names, how it is supposed to be written. And in some platforms, it's totally wrong. And you're like, how does this information come there, you know? And then I'm really like, oh, no, I'm not going to think about it. I mean, I'm Googling, and then I'm finding the EP somewhere totally random in some communities, and they're rating it, and they are talking about it. And this is really interesting how it goes everywhere, and without you knowing, and then you research it, and it's like, wow, this is funny. But it is small money in the end, and it's how it is working. Also on Spotify, this is also really interesting that they really, bigger labels or independent labels, so they curate now this playlist, you know, there's like Warp playlist, there's like, so it's so funny. And then also smaller artists retweet this playlist, and they say, I'm in the playlist now. And I think it's really nice how they are curating the playlist, and it makes you money. Then they put like a little like mainstream music, then a little more smaller artists, and then they try their artists also to get like money from it. And then it's like, this is an interesting idea. The playlist Spotify is a thing now, and it's not getting you so much money. Like you won't, as a small label, you won't benefit so much, but there are people paying and people pre-ordering, and that's really nice, you know, and this is it's a good thing. I mean, how could you make them pay more? I mean, like in the event situation, it's really also restricted towards a price, you know. You cannot, it's also different access. If you say, please pay €12 or €18 would be even better, you know, but it's like a different thing. If you go out every weekend, pay €18 at the door, then you don't have so much money at the end of the weekend anymore. So it's like where does this money come from? If you say it comes from the consumer, and we try to change the consumer behavior in the sense that they are giving more music, more money to music. How we could do that. But I also really like the Resonate idea, because it's such a good idea, and how you, when you sign up, and how the platform is talking to you is actually already really different, you know. Like you feel welcome, and you feel like someone is taking care. And if you are really using like music distribution or anything like else, you really think like you talk on like mobile hotline, you know, you're waiting for 30 minutes, no one is talking to you, no one is, if you yeah, with the distributor, but we don't have like a contract or anything like that, but it's like if you use like digital aggregators, and then it's like taking, like then you need to get a deal with like digital distribution company, then they take a cut, then you might end up doing vinyl, then you have more budget into your music. So
I'm wondering with some of those like Spotify you mentioned also before, the Spotify players influences the festivals, and so with some of those players being so large and dominant already, what do you think like alternative approaches coming up now like resonate, or so what's the chance even for them to come because of the network effects and everything that's in the favor of those who already have all the repertoire at this point? What do you think about?
Well, I mean, I think there's always some room. There's some room for competition. So, maybe I'm more hesitant to just vilify somebody like SoundCloud or Spotify. I mean, I think the reality is a lot of artists have gravitated to Spotify and SoundCloud and Bandcamp for different reasons, because they were able to find some sort of traction there. You know, they were able to find some kind of solution. They were able to kind of get some of their music out. So I agree with all of the criticisms that are here. Then you'll hear me gripe about them too. But I have at least some optimism, so talking to people about some of the positives from those services. There should be room, there should be lots of room. If there's so much music being made and so much music being consumed, there should be room out there for some new ideas. Now, unless, and this is a Silicon Valley problem, unless there's a kind of a tiny number of tech companies who determine all of the funding and the direction for the whole industry. That's obviously not so good. But I mean, Bandcamp is a good solution, and I think both of your initiatives are good examples too. In that, you know, we can talk about kind of solving affordable housing globally, and then we can also talk about kind of like solving affordable housing in Kreuzberg. You know. We might have, and the impact of solving affordable housing in Kreuzberg is just as real, maybe more real, because we might get somewhere. So Bandcamp, for instance, became hugely successful in a business that had never existed before, which was people going and buying independent video game soundtracks. And so now there's a whole economy around that, and there's a whole group of listeners, and the music sounds kind of like nothing has ever really sounded before, because this is a totally new culture that didn't exist before. And there's a little healthy kind of little underground composition market too, so that you got everything there. So I think, you know, as we continue to kind of focus on our own human scale and continue to do some of the things that we do, while we may not solve the overarching problems, part of the reason that some of us are not necessarily venture capital funders is that we may be better working on that scale. And there's some exciting things happening there.
Disagree, sorry. I mean, I agree. I agree. It's interesting you mentioned independent video game soundtracks, right? I have friends in the independent video game industry, and they sell stuff. You can make independent video games and live a healthy life. And in fact, in many ways, culturally, because there's a lot of money involved in that and a lot of goodwill, and again, fomented a sense of identity in opposition to a dominant industry, a dominant kind of dumbed down industry. There are use cases all over the world, right? Like, you can look at different industries where people are paying for this stuff. The thing where I agree with you and I disagree with you simultaneously, I agree with you on the DL, because when you're talking about network effects, platform monopolies, and venture capital, and the fact that if you speak to anyone in Silicon Valley and you talk to them about music, they see it as a problem that's been solved. Because in their mind also, music is not something that evolves. It's a WAV file, and then you have bands, and it looks like a band from the 70s. It's like, no. If we were to start being a bit more ambitious with this, of saying, well, no, you can have that. If you want that representation of music, by all means, stream it, put it on playlists, whatever. We want to be something different. There are markets out there. And so while I agree with you on the one hand, I also demand we be more ambitious. Because there's also like a kind of diplomatic acceptance of the current state of affairs that, while I think has rationale to it, I also think can also somewhat placate a sense of urgency around this. Where for me, it's not necessarily, music will always exist. and it will always have some degree of value. For me, my interest in music is in its relevancy. And when I see the way that these platform monopolies represent music, and you go to the festivals and it's the same thing and the same thing, and then, oh, it's the 80s now and it's the 90s and so on and so forth, and we just blissfully forget that we're living in this new technological age where anything could happen. I agree with you, and I also think, no, if we were to start being a bit more ambitious and a bit more insistent on this, there's a market out there, and you can look at other markets to see good examples of that. You know, and so ultimately well, for example, the independent video game market, where there are like huge amounts of money transacted. There's a site called Humble Bundle, for example, that a friend of mine had a game sold through, where I'll botch the figures, but an abstract amount of money is spent on bundled video games that go out through a newsletter. And there's a story behind that, and there's an identity behind it. And I think there's so much goodwill within musical communities that we could foment a similar sense of urgency, but we're not going to get there through kind of, you know, satisfying diplomatically our relationships with Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever. But you know what I'm saying, or just kind of like relativizing it. There are opportunities out there, is all I'm saying. And again, to bring it back, fundamentally, it's an aesthetic problem. Because music, if you take away the relevant, like the music's power to represent people on the margins, to insert new things through these time-worn cultural mechanisms into greater cultural discourse, if you remove that, you've lost it. That's what music is for me. You know, I can listen to 1,600 people making techno records at home. I don't care. You know, it's not coffee table music. It's more than that. And so if we start seeding this to playlist cultures that, for example, don't represent the labels. You know, try finding a Warp Records page on Spotify. You'll find their playlists, but try finding a page. That's problematic for me, and I think we could do better.
Do you see where you talked about Resonate, but do you see any example where you would say, oh, this is actually a good
Sure. I think, I mean, you brought up Bandcamp. I think Bandcamp is a good, honest service. It's kind of like a storefront, right? You go in there, you pay money, they take a cut, you get money. It's great. For me, my personal interests, again, it represents music up until a certain point, and I think we could do better. I think the way that people interact around music now presents all these wonderful opportunities for monetization and experimentation that kind of stops short of Bandcamp. Bandcamp is a place to listen to linear music and transact as if you were buying a record 20 years ago, except now it's more convenient. That's fine, and that's great for a certain expectation. So I like Bandcamp and I use it, but I think we can think bigger, and that's where the blockchain comes in, and so on and so forth. What else is there to this?
Yeah, okay, I see. So, okay, we have 1 minute. Ooh.
What? I have an even simpler enemy.
Huh?
I have an even simpler enemy than Matt, which is I just think this. Spotify's run by some musicians. They're musicians who are happy with them. They listen to feedback from musicians. SoundCloud, I think that the same is true. There are even people at iTunes where the same is true. There's tons of problems with them, plenty to criticize, and let's keep criticizing them. But Facebook, the problem is Facebook. Facebook has now become the gatekeeper to where everybody sees their information. It's everybody's new dopamine dose for the day. It's absolutely destroying the world. And I think I can say that without fear of offending anyone at Facebook, because it wouldn't even matter. If I pissed off, if I went and pissed off Apple or SoundCloud or Spotify, I might be worried about my future as a musician. But I can literally stand here and say, like, Facebook is Satan, and it wouldn't have any impact on my music life because Facebook is totally uninterested in music. And I think if we tear down one thing, let's tear down the hegemony Facebook has on all of our lives and the way that we would get music if you could find music on Facebook, which half the time you can't.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Daniela,
I think it's also good because you mentioned on the Twitter once, because when we are Facebook is actually really important to us because that's where we put our events, that's where we are inviting our community, and that's where the community sees the events. And I always think that, and we never get this limit anymore that we are not allowed to invite any more friends because our percentage of attendance is always right. So I haven't been at this point so far. But then other people saying like, sorry, can you just attend because I'm I'm not allowed to invite anyone else anymore. And I think that is really, really crazy how this gatekeeping works. And you mentioned on Twitter once that we do like email rounds and really. I mean, we write emails and ask people to come, or if they would like to come, and then you need the email and the personal contact and invite people, you know, as like as the type of connection.
Yeah, maybe as a closing, I think it's like a good closing thread. I think. Matt, I found in your profile a link that you have got a group together how to get away from Facebook events.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe we can use this like as a closing to the.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, to build off both those points, for me. Peter mentioned the dopamine thing. My kind of analogy for Facebook is it's like a bar forever. Right? It's like dopamine spikes and they keep you in this one space. And I'm like, I went to bars so I could meet people and then leave the bar or find like a better environment. And the thing is, the network effect of Facebook dictates that, you know, people will leave and the one thing they miss is they don't hear about events. Yeah. I'm like, that's torture. That's really wrong. Mm-hmm. So if we were to try and build an alternative, a simple alternative to Facebook events that allowed for people to find out about things without having to go through Facebook, that could actually have a wonderful effect of weaning people off that thing. And so we put a first group together, and we've actually written a grant for it to try and move forward. If anyone's interested in it, we're hoping to build it sometime this year once the album is done. But it's these kind of little gestures that could actually ultimately have a really big impact. And that's not to even mention the dangers of having, particularly in marginal communities, queer communities, political activist communities, the danger of having all that information publicly available on an advertising network, which, not to gloat or kind of play a violin, we lost a lot of friends in the Oakland fire whose families were being called by trolls on 4chan because while they were looking for the missing, people were posting public cell phone numbers of their mothers and fathers onto a Facebook event page. Underground culture doesn't need that, right? In whatever circumstance, and after, as a result of that tragedy, there were other spaces being shut down by the police because they had a paper trail from Facebook events to say, oh yeah, well, if this person went to a party there, they also went to a party at this space. I guess they're having underground parties there. It's just it's bad vibes, you know, like. So anyway, so that's a really good, it's a really good maybe place to start in weaning people off these networks.
Okay, I think that's it. I think we'll have to wrap up here. Thank you for the conversation. And we didn't do a Q&A with the audience, but the Q&A we can do, if you have a bit of time, over a drink, because I have a bag of drink tickets here, and which you can collect from me here. And I think there's some from they are sponsored by the Berlin Music Commission and the Club Commission. Very generous. And the only thing is, I don't know exactly where we are going with them. So, so there's a networking area, which I haven't been to yet. And I don't know if the colleagues from the Club Commission or Music Commission actually know where to go, so that we can go over there together. But I have some tickets here, and Reka is over there, and she has the other ones. Yeah, she's waving there. So, okay. Well, thank you very much, and yeah, let's continue over a drink.